The winter of 1884 had teeth sharper than any wolf that prowled the Sierra Nevada, and Laura Vance felt every one of them sinking into her bones as she huddled closer to the dying embers in her stone fireplace. The cabin her husband had built 3 years ago with his own calloused hands now felt more like a tomb than a home, the walls closing in with each gust of wind that howled through the mountain pass outside Hamilton, Nevada. She pulled the threadbare quilt tighter around her shoulders, watching her breath form white clouds in the frigid air, and realized with a clarity that cut deeper than the cold that she might not survive another night alone up here in these unforgiving mountains. Thomas had been dead for 8 months now, killed when his horse spooked crossing a swollen creek last spring, and Laura had stubbornly refused every offer from the townspeople to come down from this isolated homestead before winter set in. At 24 years old, she had convinced herself that staying in the cabin they had shared, tending the small plot of land they had carved from the wilderness together, was the only way to honor his memory. Now, as the blizzard raged into its 3rd day and her woodpile dwindled to almost nothing, she understood that stubbornness and grief made poor companions when facing nature's cruelty. Her fingers had lost most of their feeling hours ago, and she fumbled with the tin of hardtack biscuits, managing to retrieve one before her hands began shaking so violently she had to set the container down. The biscuit tasted like sawdust in her dry mouth, but she forced herself to chew and swallow, knowing she needed whatever meager strength food could provide. The storm had buried her door under at least 4 feet of snow, maybe more, and even if she could somehow dig her way out, where would she go? The nearest neighbor was the Patterson Ranch, 2 miles down the mountain, and she would freeze to death before she made it halfway there in these conditions. Laura thought about praying, but the words would not come. She had prayed so desperately when Thomas lay broken and dying on the banks of that creek, had begged God to spare him, to give her just a few more years with the man she loved more than her own breath. Those prayers had gone unanswered, and she had not bothered much with talking to God since they buried Thomas in the small cemetery behind the church in Hamilton. Perhaps this was simply her fate, to join her husband in whatever came after this life, to stop fighting against the loneliness that had become her only constant companion. She fed the last 2 pieces of wood into the fire, watching the flames lick weakly at the frozen bark. Maybe another hour of warmth if she was lucky, and then nothing but cold and darkness and the eventual sleep that would claim her. Laura found herself thinking of her mother back in Ohio, the letters that had gone unanswered because writing about her life without Thomas felt like admitting he was truly gone. Her mother would never know what became of her only daughter, would spend the rest of her days wondering why the letters stopped coming. The wind screamed like a living thing, and Laura closed her eyes, letting her mind drift back to better times. She remembered the day Thomas had brought her up this mountain for the first time, how his eyes had shone with pride as he showed her the land he had claimed, the plans he had for their future. They would build a life here, he had promised, raise children who would grow strong in the clean mountain air, create something lasting and good. She had believed him, had thrown herself into the dream with all the fierce determination that had carried her west from her childhood home. Now that dream lay as cold and dead as the man who had dreamed it, and Laura felt the last reserves of her strength beginning to ebb away. She slumped against the rough wooden wall, pulling her knees up to her chest, trying to conserve what little body heat remained. Her eyelids grew heavy despite her best efforts to stay awake, and she knew that falling asleep now would likely mean never waking again. The sound, when it came, seemed at first like part of the storm itself, a rhythmic thumping that might have been a loose shutter or a branch beating against the cabin. But then it grew louder, more purposeful, and Laura forced her eyes open, confusion cutting through the fog of cold and exhaustion. Someone was digging, the sound of a shovel biting into packed snow unmistakable even through the thick log walls. She tried to call out, but her voice emerged as barely a whisper, her throat too dry and frozen to produce more than a croak. The digging continued, faster now, and then suddenly the door shuddered as something heavy slammed against it from the outside. Once, twice, 3 times, and then with a crack of breaking ice, the door flew inward, bringing with it a cascade of snow and a blast of frigid air that nearly extinguished her feeble fire. A man stood in the doorway, so covered in snow and ice that he looked more like a winter spirit than a human being. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and as he stepped into the cabin and pushed the door closed behind him, Laura could make out dark eyes in a weathered face, a strong jaw shadowed with several days of stubble. He moved with urgent purpose, crossing to the fireplace and dropping an armload of wood he had somehow carried with him. "You are alive, thank God," he said, his voice rough but warm, carrying the slight drawl of someone who had spent years working cattle under the western sun. "I was afraid I would be too late." Laura stared at him, unable to form words, her mind struggling to process this impossible salvation. The man worked quickly, building up the fire until flames leaped and crackled, filling the small cabin with blessed heat and light. Only then did he turn his full attention to her, and she saw concern etched deep in the lines around his eyes. "My name is Garrett Anderson," he said, kneeling down beside her so they were at eye level. "I have the ranch about 2 miles down the mountain. When the storm hit, I remembered you were up here alone, and I could not stop thinking about whether you had enough supplies to weather it." "I do not," Laura managed to whisper, her voice sounding strange and foreign to her own ears. "Almost out of everything." Garrett nodded as if he had expected as much. "I brought food and more wood, enough to keep you going for several days. But Mrs. Vance, when this storm breaks, you cannot stay up here. It is not safe, not alone, not with winter just getting started." Mrs. Vance. The name felt like a ghost, a reminder of a life that no longer existed. "Laura," she said quietly, "just Laura." Something flickered in Garrett's eyes, understanding perhaps, or sympathy, and he nodded slowly. "Laura, then. Let me get you something warm to drink, and then we need to get you warmed up proper before the cold does any permanent damage." He stood and moved to his pack, which she now noticed sitting near the door, and pulled out a tin pot and a small cloth bag. Within minutes, he had snow melting over the fire and was adding what smelled like coffee grounds and something else, something sweet and spicy. The scent alone seemed to revive something in Laura, some spark of life she had thought extinguished. Garrett poured the steaming liquid into a tin cup and brought it to her, wrapping her stiff fingers around the warm metal. "Drink slowly," he instructed. "It has got some whiskey and cinnamon in it, will help get your blood moving again." Laura obeyed, taking small sips of the concoction, feeling the warmth spread through her chest and belly like liquid sunlight. The whiskey burned in the best possible way, and the sweetness of the cinnamon cut through the harsh bite of the coffee. She had never tasted anything more wonderful in her entire life. "How did you make it up here in this storm?" she asked when she had drunk about half the cup, her voice growing stronger. "It is impossible out there." "Nearly was impossible," Garrett admitted, settling down across from her with his own cup of the fortified coffee. "Took me most of a day to cover 2 miles, and my horse is sheltered in that lean-to you have got out back, probably cursing my name for bringing him out in this weather. But I kept thinking about you up here, and I could not shake the feeling that you needed help." Laura studied him more carefully now that the immediate crisis had passed, and some feeling was returning to her extremities. Garrett Anderson looked to be in his early 30s, with the kind of solid, capable presence that came from years of hard work and self-reliance. His coat was well made but worn, his boots scuffed and practical, everything about him speaking of a man who knew how to survive in this harsh country. "I do not understand why you would risk your life for me," Laura said honestly. "We have never even met. I have seen you in town maybe once or twice, but we have never spoken." Garrett looked down at his coffee, and in the firelight Laura thought she saw color rise in his weathered cheeks. "I knew your husband a bit," he said quietly. "Thomas and I worked together on a cattle drive about 5 years back, before either of us had settled in these parts. He was a good man, talked about you all the time, about how he was going to save up enough to bring you west and start a life together. When I heard he had died, I thought about coming to pay my respects, but I figured you had enough people bothering you without adding a near stranger to the mix." He paused, took a long drink of his coffee, then continued. "But when that storm rolled in and I thought about you up here alone, I remembered something Thomas said once. We were sitting around a campfire, and he told me that if anything ever happened to him, he hoped someone would look after you, because you were the kind of person who would never ask for help, even when you needed it most. Said it was one of the things he loved about you and one of the things that worried him most." Laura felt tears prick at her eyes, the first she had cried in weeks. "He said that, he did. So I figured, storm or no storm, I owed it to Thomas to make sure you were all right. And I am damn glad I came, because Laura, you would not have lasted another night up here." The truth of his words settled over them both, heavy and undeniable. Laura set down her cup and covered her face with her hands, and the tears came then in earnest, great racking sobs that shook her whole body. She cried for Thomas, for the future they would never have, for the loneliness and fear of these past months, for the stubborn pride that had nearly killed her. Garrett moved closer, and after a moment's hesitation, put his arm around her shoulders, letting her cry against his chest. He did not say anything, did not offer empty platitudes or false comfort, just held her steady while the storm of grief worked its way through her system. His coat smelled like wood smoke and leather and horses, smells that reminded her of Thomas, and yet somehow this man felt entirely different, solid and real and impossibly, miraculously present. When the tears finally subsided, Laura pulled back, embarrassed by her breakdown. "I am sorry," she said, wiping at her face with shaking hands. "I have been holding that in for too long, I think." "No need to apologize," Garrett said gently. "Grief is not something a person should have to carry alone." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the fire crackle and the wind howl outside. The cabin was growing genuinely warm now, and Laura felt life returning to her frozen limbs, along with the sharp pins and needles sensation that came with restored circulation. "I need you to listen to me carefully," Garrett said finally, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "This storm is going to blow itself out, probably by tomorrow evening if the signs I saw on the way up here hold true. When it does, you need to come down the mountain with me. You cannot stay up here for the winter, Laura. It is not just about supplies or firewood. This country will kill you if you are alone, and I do not think Thomas would want that." Laura wanted to argue, to insist on her independence, to cling to the last physical connection she had to her dead husband. But looking around the cabin, seeing it through fresh eyes, she recognized the futility of such stubbornness. The cabin was poorly chinked, the roof had developed several leaks that she had patched inadequately, and her stores of food and fuel had been insufficient even before the blizzard hit. She had been slowly dying up here, and some part of her had known it and not cared. "Where would I go?" she asked quietly. I have no money for boarding in town, and I will not accept charity. You would come to my ranch, Garrett said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. I have a housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, a widow herself who manages the household and does the cooking. She has been after me for months to hire some help. Says the place is too much for one person to manage. You would have your own room, honest work, and wages that would let you save up enough to figure out what you want to do come spring. Laura studied his face, looking for any sign of impropriety or ulterior motive, but found only sincere concern. You would do that. Take in a stranger. You are not a stranger, Garrett said firmly. You are the widow of a man I respected, and more than that, you are someone who needs help. That is enough. The offer was so unexpected, so genuinely kind, that Laura found herself nodding before she could fully think through the implications. All right, she said. When the storm breaks, I will go with you. Garrett's face split into a smile that transformed his weathered features, making him look younger and less careworn. Good. That is good, Laura. You have made the right choice. They spent the rest of that day, and the long night that followed in the cabin, with Garrett keeping the fire fed and preparing simple but nourishing meals from the supplies he had brought. He told her about his ranch, the Patterson place, which he had bought from the previous owners when they decided to move back east. It was a modest operation, about 300 head of cattle and a dozen horses, with a solid house and good grazing land. I run it mostly by myself, with help from a couple of hands during calving season and when it is time to drive cattle to market, he explained. It is not the biggest spread in these parts, but it is mine free and clear, and it provides a decent living. Laura found herself drawn into his stories, the easy way he talked about the land and the animals, the clear love he had for the life he had built. She learned that he had come west after the Civil War, too young to have fought but old enough to want to escape the poverty and destruction that had ravaged his native Tennessee. He had worked as a ranch hand, a buffalo hunter, a scout for the army, and finally had saved enough to buy his own place. Never thought much about settling down permanent-like until I got the ranch, Garrett admitted. But there is something about having your own land, building something that will last, makes a man think about the future different. Laura understood that sentiment all too well. She told him about her own journey west, how she had grown up in a small Ohio town where opportunities for women were limited to teaching school or making a good marriage. Thomas had been a traveling salesman when they met, full of dreams and ambitions, and when he proposed, promising her adventure and a chance at a new life, she had said yes without hesitation. We were happy, she said quietly, staring into the fire. Not rich, not comfortable all the time, but happy. He worked so hard to make this place livable, to build something we could be proud of. And then one moment of bad luck, one spooked horse, and it all just ended. Life is fragile out here, Garrett agreed. I have lost friends to accidents, disease, violence. It is part of what makes me think we owe it to each other to help when we can, because any of us could be the one needing help next time. The storm continued to rage through the night, but inside the cabin, Laura felt safer than she had in months. Garrett insisted she take the bed while he rolled out his bedding near the fire, and though she protested, he was adamant. For the first time since Thomas died, Laura slept deeply and dreamlessly, warm and secure in the knowledge that she was not alone. Morning brought a subtle shift in the quality of the wind, a lessening of the storm's fury that suggested Garrett had been right about the weather breaking soon. They ate a breakfast of fried salt pork and cornmeal cakes, and Laura began the process of packing up the few possessions she wanted to take with her. Most of what she and Thomas had accumulated could stay here. It was just furniture and household goods, things that could be replaced. But she carefully wrapped Thomas's pocket watch, the letters he had written her during their courtship, and the photograph they had taken on their wedding day. "The cabin will still be here come spring," Garrett said, watching her pack. "If you decide you want to come back, try again, that option will be available. But Laura, I hope you will at least consider selling this place, using the money to start fresh somewhere that does not carry so much pain." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Part of her knew he was right, that clinging to this isolated homestead was clinging to grief itself. But letting go felt like betrayal, like admitting that the dreams she and Thomas had shared meant nothing. By midday, the snow had stopped falling and the wind had died down to occasional gusts. Garrett ventured outside and returned with his horse, a sturdy bay gelding that looked exhausted but sound. "We will have to walk and lead him," Garrett said. "Snow is too deep and unstable for riding, but he can carry our supplies." Laura bundled up in every piece of warm clothing she owned, and they set out into a world transformed by the storm. Snow lay in massive drifts, some taller than her head, and the landscape had become an alien place of white and shadow. But the sky was clearing to a brilliant blue, and the sun glittered off the snow with blinding intensity. The journey down the mountain was exhausting and treacherous. Several times Laura stumbled and would have fallen if not for Garrett's steadying hand. He seemed to have an instinct for finding the safest path, testing the snow ahead with a long stick to avoid hidden obstacles or weak spots that might give way beneath their weight. They had to stop frequently to rest, and during one such break, Laura asked the question that had been nagging at her since Garrett first appeared at her door. "Why are you not married? You have a successful ranch, you are clearly a good man. I would think women would be lining up." Garrett laughed, but it was a sad sound. Not much opportunity for courting when you spend most of your time alone on a mountain with 300 cows for company. And truth be told, I have been particular. Seen too many men rush into marriage with someone they barely know, just because they want a woman around to cook and clean and warm their bed. That never seemed right to me. If I am going to share my life with someone, I want it to be because we genuinely care for each other, not just because it is convenient. "That is a rare perspective," Laura said softly. "Most men I have known do not think that way." "Then you have known the wrong men," Garrett replied with a hint of that transformative smile. Though clearly not Thomas, he was one of the good ones. They reached the Patterson ranch as the sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. The house was larger than Laura had expected, a two-story structure built of stone and timber that looked solid enough to withstand anything nature could throw at it. Smoke curled from the chimney, and as they approached, the front door flew open and a small, sturdy woman came rushing out. "Mr. Anderson, thank the heavens," she exclaimed in accented English. "I have been worried sick, thinking you froze to death up on that mountain. I am fine. Mrs. Chen and I found Mrs. Vance alive, though it was a close thing." Garrett helped Laura toward the house. "She will be staying with us for the winter, helping you with the household as we discussed might be necessary." Mrs. Chen, who Laura guessed to be somewhere in her 50s, took one look at Laura's exhausted, frozen state and immediately switched into a mothering mode that reminded Laura painfully of her own mother. Within minutes, Laura found herself in a warm kitchen with a bowl of hot soup in front of her, while Mrs. Chen bustled about, barking instructions at Garrett to bring in the supplies and put his horse away properly. The house was comfortable and well kept, with simple but sturdy furniture and curtains on the windows. Mrs. Chen showed Laura to a small bedroom on the second floor that had a real bed with a thick quilt, a dresser, and a rocking chair by the window. It was more luxury than Laura had experienced in years, and she felt tears threaten again at the sheer relief of being somewhere safe and warm. You rest now, Mrs. Chen said firmly. Tomorrow we talk about work and arrangements. Tonight you just recover from your ordeal. Laura slept for 12 hours straight and woke to pale winter sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of bacon frying. She dressed in one of the 2 dresses she had brought with her, feeling self-conscious about her shabby appearance, and made her way downstairs. Mrs. Chen was alone in the kitchen, working on what looked like enough food to feed an army. She looked up when Laura entered and nodded approvingly. Good, you look better. Not so much like a ghost anymore. Sit, eat, and then we will talk. Over breakfast, Mrs. Chen explained the running of the household. Garrett was often out working on the ranch from dawn until dusk, and sometimes stayed overnight in the line shack on the far pasture during calving season or when weather threatened the herd. The house needed constant attention. Cleaning, mending, laundry, cooking, preserving food, managing the chickens and the kitchen garden is too much for one person, especially one person who is getting old like me, Mrs. Chen said with brutal honesty. I tell Mr. Anderson for months we need help, but he worries about money. Now he brings you, so I think he finally listens. Laura learned that Mrs. Chen was Chinese, had come to Nevada during the mining boom with her husband, who had worked on the railroad. When he died in an accident 10 years ago, she had been left with nothing, and Garrett's father, who had owned the ranch before him, had hired her to keep house. She had stayed on when Garrett inherited the place and clearly ran the household with firm efficiency. The days fell into a rhythm that Laura found both exhausting and healing. She threw herself into the work, scrubbing floors until they gleamed, mending clothes and linens, helping Mrs. Chen with the cooking and preserving. The older woman was a patient teacher, showing Laura techniques and recipes she had never encountered before, blending Chinese traditions with Western practicality. Garrett treated Laura with unfailing courtesy and respect, always making sure she felt like a valued employee rather than a charity case. He paid her wages at the end of each week, fair money that she carefully saved in an old coffee tin in her room. In the evenings, if he was not too exhausted from ranch work, he would sit by the fire with Laura and Mrs. Chen, talking about the day or reading aloud from one of the books in his small but well-used library. Laura found herself watching Garrett more than she probably should, noticing the way his face lit up when he talked about a successful day with the cattle, the careful gentleness with which he handled the ranch animals, the quiet patience he showed when explaining something new to her. He was nothing like Thomas, who had been shorter and stockier, quicker to laugh and more openly affectionate. But there was something deeply attractive about Garrett's steady, reliable presence, the sense that he was a man who kept his word and did what needed doing without complaint. Christmas came, and to Laura's surprise, Garrett presented both her and Mrs. Chen with gifts. For Mrs. Chen, he had bought expensive tea from the Mercantile in Hamilton, a luxury the older woman clearly treasured. For Laura, he had a book of poetry by Walt Whitman, something she had once mentioned admiring during one of their evening conversations. I hope it is all right, Garrett said, suddenly looking uncertain. I know it is not much, but when I saw it at the store, I thought of you. Laura held the book like it was made of gold, running her fingers over the embossed cover. It is perfect, she said softly. Thank you, Garrett, truly. That night after Mrs. Chen had retired to her room, Laura and Garrett sat by the fire, Laura reading poems aloud while Garrett listened with his eyes closed. When she reached, "When I heard the learned astronomer," her voice faltered on the final lines about looking up in perfect silence at the stars, and she had to stop, overcome by emotion. "What is wrong?" Garrett asked, sitting up and looking at her with concern. "Thomas and I used to look at the stars together," Laura said quietly. It was one of our favorite things to do, sitting outside on warm nights trying to name the constellations. I have not been able to look at them since he died. It hurt too much." Garrett was quiet for a long moment, and then he stood and held out his hand. "Come with me." Laura let him lead her to the front door, where he helped her into her coat and boots. They walked out into the cold, clear night, and Garrett pointed up at the sky, which was ablaze with more stars than seemed possible. "I cannot replace what you had with Thomas," Garrett said quietly, "and I would never try. But Laura, you are still alive, and those stars are still there, still beautiful. Maybe it is time to let yourself see them again, not as a reminder of what you lost, but as a promise that there is still beauty in the world, still reasons to keep going." Laura looked up at the stars, feeling tears freeze on her cheeks, but this time they were not entirely tears of grief. Standing there in the snow with Garrett beside her, solid and warm and impossibly kind, she felt something shift inside her, some small crack in the wall of sorrow she had built around her heart. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. For saving my life, for giving me this chance, for reminding me that the world is still here." They stood together in the cold until Laura was shivering, and then Garrett ushered her back inside, making sure she warmed up by the fire before sending her up to bed. But something had changed between them that night, some unspoken understanding that they were becoming more than employer and employee, more than survivor and rescuer. They were becoming friends and possibly, though neither of them was ready to name it yet, something more. January brought bitter cold but no major storms, and Laura continued to settle into her new life. She and Mrs. Chen developed an easy partnership, and Laura found satisfaction in the routine of household work, the tangible results of her labor. The house sparkled under their combined care. Meals were hearty and delicious, and even Garrett's two ranch hands, grizzled cowboys named Pete and Sam who lived in the bunkhouse, began commenting on how much more pleasant life at the Patterson Ranch had become. But Laura also noticed that Garrett was going out of his way to spend time with her. He would ask her opinion on ranch decisions, invite her to ride out with him to check on the cattle when the weather was clear, teach her about animal husbandry and ranch management as if her input actually mattered. At first, Laura thought he was just being kind, including her so she would not feel isolated. But as the weeks passed, she began to recognize the way his eyes sought her out when he came in from work, the way his face brightened when she laughed at something he said, the careful way he avoided touching her even casually, as if afraid of overstepping. Laura did not know what to do with this realization. Part of her felt guilty, as if having feelings for another man, any man, would somehow dishonor Thomas's memory. But another part, the part that had nearly frozen to death alone in that cabin, recognized that life had to go on, that the dead had no use for her loyalty, but the living might have need of her love. In early February, a warmer spell brought an early thaw, and Garrett decided it was time to ride into Hamilton for supplies. He invited Laura to come along, saying she might enjoy getting off the ranch for a day and seeing people other than him and Mrs. Chen. The town of Hamilton was small but bustling, the county seat of White Pine County, still hanging on despite the decline of the mining boom that had built it. Laura had not been to town since before Thomas died, and she felt nervous as they rode down the main street, aware of the curious looks from townspeople who recognized her. At the Mercantile, Garrett introduced her to several people, making it clear through his manner that Laura was under his protection, and anyone who treated her with anything less than respect would answer to him. Laura appreciated the gesture, though it also made her uncomfortably aware of how their living arrangement might look to outsiders, Her fears were confirmed when they ran into Judith Martin, a woman Laura knew slightly from church. Judith looked from Laura to Garrett and back again, her expression growing pinched. "Mrs. Vance, I am surprised to see you out and about," Judith said with false sweetness. "We had heard you were staying at the Patterson Ranch this winter. How fortunate for you to have found such accommodating employment." The emphasis on the last word made her meaning clear, and Laura felt her face flush. But before she could respond, Garrett stepped forward, his expression harder than Laura had ever seen it. "Mrs. Vance is an employee of mine, yes, working as a housekeeper alongside Mrs. Chen," he said coldly. "If you are implying anything else, I suggest you think carefully about spreading rumors that could damage the reputation of a widow who has already suffered enough loss." "I would take such gossip very personally." Judith paled and hurried away, and Laura found she was trembling with a mixture of anger and humiliation. Garrett touched her elbow gently. "I am sorry you had to endure that," he said quietly. "People talk because they have nothing better to do. But anyone who knows me or Mrs. Chen knows that everything is proper and above board." "I know," Laura said, but the encounter had shaken her. She had been so focused on surviving, on getting through each day, that she had not really considered how her situation might appear to others. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. But as they approached the house, Garrett pulled his horse to a stop and turned to look at Laura. "I want you to know that I would never do anything to compromise your reputation or make you uncomfortable," he said seriously. "If you want, we can hire an additional person to stay at the house, someone who can act as a chaperone so there is no question about propriety." Laura considered this, then shook her head. "That seems like a waste of money and an insult to Mrs. Chen, who has been chaperone enough for any reasonable person. Let people talk if they want to. I know the truth, and so do you." Garrett smiled at that, warm and genuine. "You are a strong woman, Laura Vance, stronger than you probably realize." "I am learning," Laura replied. "Or maybe relearning. I think I forgot for a while after Thomas died." As winter slowly gave way to early spring, the relationship between Laura and Garrett continued to deepen and evolve. They spent hours talking, sharing stories about their pasts, their dreams, their fears. Laura learned that Garrett had once been in love with a woman back in Tennessee, but she had married someone else while he was away working. The betrayal had been part of what drove him west, searching for a new start. "I thought I would never trust anyone again," Garrett admitted one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Thought it was safer to be alone than to risk being hurt like that again. But then I realized I was not really living, just existing, and that is no way to spend the one life we get." Laura understood that sentiment all too well. "I think that is what I was doing in that cabin," she said slowly. "Not living, just existing. Waiting to die, really, without quite admitting it to myself. You saved my life in more ways than just keeping me from freezing, Garrett. You reminded me that life is still worth living." Garrett reached over and took her hand, the first time he had deliberately touched her in months. His hand was warm and calloused from ranch work, strong and steady. "Laura, I need to tell you something, and I want you to know that there are no expectations attached to it. You can stay here as an employee for as long as you want, regardless of how you respond." Laura's heart began to pound. "All right. I have developed feelings for you," Garrett said quietly, looking at their joined hands rather than at her face. "Deep feelings. I think I started falling in love with you the first time I heard you laugh at one of Mrs. Chen's stories, really laugh, like you were allowing yourself to feel joy again. And every day since then, those feelings have just grown stronger. But I know you are still grieving Thomas, and I know it has not even been a year since he died. so I'm not asking you for anything. I just needed you to know, needed to be honest with you." Laura sat very still, processing his words. She thought about Thomas, about the love they had shared, and realized with a bittersweet ache that she would always love him, that he would always be part of her story. But she also realized that her heart, which she had thought too broken to ever feel anything again, had somehow begun to heal. And a large part of that healing was due to the man sitting beside her, holding her hand like it was something precious. "I have feelings for you too," she said quietly. "I have been trying not to, feeling guilty about it, as if I was betraying Thomas. But Garrett, if our positions were reversed, if I had died and Thomas had survived, I would want him to find happiness again. I would not want him to spend the rest of his life alone and grieving. So I think, maybe, I need to give myself permission to feel what I am feeling." Garrett looked up at her then, his dark eyes intense in the fading light. "And what are you feeling, Laura?" "That I am falling in love with you," she said simply. "That I feel safe with you, happy with you, like I could build a new future without forgetting the past. Is that possible, do you think? To honor what was while embracing what could be? I think that is the only way to truly live," Garrett said. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "We will go as slow as you need, Laura. There is no rush. We have time." But time, it seemed, had other plans. 2 weeks later, a neighbor rode up to the ranch with news that there had been a prairie fire over in the next county, driven by high winds, and several ranchers had lost everything. Garrett immediately began organizing a relief effort, gathering supplies and cattle to help the affected families. "I need to go over there," he told Laura. "Could be gone for a week, maybe 2, depending on how much help is needed. Will you be all right here with Mrs. Chen and the boys?" "Of course," Laura assured him. "But Garrett, be careful, those fires can be unpredictable." "I will." He hesitated, then pulled her into a quick, fierce hug. "I will come back, Laura, I promise." And he did come back, 12 days later, exhausted and soot-stained but unharmed. Laura ran out to meet him when she saw him riding up, and without thinking about propriety or proper grieving periods or what anyone might say, she threw her arms around him and held tight. "I was so worried," she said into his shoulder. "Every day you were gone, I kept imagining the worst." Garrett held her close, and when she finally pulled back, he cupped her face in his hands and looked at her with such love and longing that it took her breath away. "May I kiss you?" he asked quietly. "Laura, please, may I kiss you?" "Yes," she whispered. And then his lips were on hers, gentle at first and then deeper, more passionate, and Laura felt like she was falling and flying at the same time. This was different from kissing Thomas, different but no less wonderful, and when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Laura knew with absolute certainty that she had found love again, improbable and precious. "Marry me," Garrett said urgently. "I know it is soon. I know people will talk, but Laura, I love you and I want to spend my life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to build a life together, have children if we are blessed with them, grow old watching sunsets from that porch. Please say yes." Laura thought about all the reasons she should say no, or at least say wait. She had only been widowed for 10 months. People would talk, would say she had not mourned Thomas properly, would whisper that she had trapped Garrett while living in his house. But she also thought about that cabin on the mountain, about how close she had come to giving up on life entirely, and how Garrett had not just saved her but had helped her remember who she was and who she wanted to be. "Yes," she said clearly. "Yes, I will marry you, Garrett Anderson. But can we wait until it has been a full year since Thomas died? Not because I am ashamed of loving you, but because I want to do this right, to honor both what I had and what we are building together. We can wait as long as you need," Garrett promised. though I reserve the right to court you properly in the meantime, to take you on rides and bring you flowers and generally make a fool of myself like a young man in love." Laura laughed, feeling lighter than she had in over a year. "I think I would like that very much." The next few months were some of the happiest of Laura's life. True to his word, Garrett courted her with single-minded determination, finding excuses to ride into town together, bringing her wildflowers he picked on the range, reading to her in the evenings with his head in her lap. Mrs. Chen watched it all with approval, telling Laura privately that she had prayed for years that Mr. Anderson would find a good woman to share his life with. "You are good for him," Mrs. Chen said. "Make him smile, make him remember there is more to life than work and cattle. And he is good for you too. Help you come back to life." As the year anniversary of Thomas's death approached, Laura rode up to the cabin on the mountain one last time, with Garrett accompanying her but hanging back to give her privacy. She stood in the doorway of the place she had shared with Thomas, remembering the good times and the hard times, the love and the loss. "I will always love you," she whispered to the ghost of her past. "You were my first love and you made me who I am. But I am going to marry Garrett and I am going to build a new life. I think you would like him, Thomas. I think you would approve." The wind sighed through the pine trees, and Laura chose to hear it as a benediction. She locked the cabin door and walked back to where Garrett waited with the horses, ready to return to the ranch, and the future they were building together. They were married in late May of 1885, in the small church in Hamilton with Mrs. Chen and the ranch hands as witnesses. Laura wore a simple blue dress, practical and pretty, and carried wildflowers Garrett had picked that morning. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett kissed her with such joy that even the few disapproving faces in the congregation could not dampen their happiness. The wedding night was tender and passionate, Laura finding that love the second time around was no less powerful for being different. Garrett was patient and attentive, making sure she felt cherished and desired, and afterward they lay tangled together in his bed, their bed now, talking about their dreams for the future. "I want to expand the ranch," Garrett said, trailing his fingers up and down her arm. "Not too big, but enough that we can hire more help, maybe bring in some sheep along with the cattle. And I want children if we are blessed with them. Want to hear the sound of young voices in this house, want to teach a son or daughter about ranching and the land." "I want that too," Laura said softly. "I want to fill this house with life and love and laughter. I want to prove that second chances are real, that we can honor the past while building something new and beautiful." Summer arrived in full glory, and Laura threw herself into being a wife and partner in a way that felt both familiar and entirely new. She worked alongside Mrs. Chen to manage the household, but also began riding out with Garrett more often, learning about ranch management and the business side of their operation. Garrett valued her input, discussing decisions with her as an equal partner, and Laura found that she had a knack for the practical aspects of running a ranch. By autumn, Laura suspected she might be pregnant, and when the doctor in Hamilton confirmed it, she could barely contain her joy. Garrett's reaction was even more exuberant, swinging her up in his arms despite her protests that he would hurt his back, declaring it the best news he had ever received. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "A real, actual baby, our baby." "That is generally how this works," Laura teased, but she was crying happy tears even as she laughed. The pregnancy was uneventful, and Laura continued working around the ranch until she grew too large to be comfortable. Mrs. Chen fussed over her like a mother hen, making sure she ate properly and got enough rest, and Garrett treated her like she was made of spun glass, despite her insistence that pregnancy was not an illness. On a cold March night in 1886, almost exactly 2 years after Garrett had broken through the snow to save her life, Laura went into labor. Mrs. Chen sent Pete racing to Hamilton for the doctor, while she helped Laura through the early stages. Garrett paced the floor downstairs, useless and anxious, until Mrs. Chen finally took pity on him and let him come up to be with his wife. "I am here," he said, taking Laura's hand as another contraction gripped her. "I am right here, love. You are doing so well." The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. But finally, as the sun reached its zenith, their son came into the world with a lusty cry that made Garrett laugh and cry at the same time. The doctor placed the baby in Laura's arms, and she looked down at the tiny, perfect face, seeing traces of both herself and Garrett in his features. "He is beautiful," she whispered. "He is absolutely perfect. What should we name him?" Garrett asked, touching one tiny hand with his finger, marveling when the baby gripped it tight. Laura thought for a moment, then said quietly, "I would like to name him Thomas Garrett Anderson, to honor the past while celebrating the present, if that is all right with you." Garrett's eyes filled with tears. "That is more than all right. That is perfect, Laura. You are perfect." Little Thomas, who they quickly took to calling Tommy, was a healthy, happy baby who brought even more life and joy to the ranch. Laura had never felt more content, watching Garrett transform into a devoted father who would pace the floors at night soothing a crying infant and make silly faces to elicit baby giggles. Mrs. Chen doted on the child as if he were her own grandson, and even the grizzled ranch hands would soften when Tommy was brought out to visit. As Tommy grew from infant to toddler, Laura found herself reflecting on how dramatically her life had changed. If someone had told her, that day she was freezing to death in her cabin, that 2 years later she would be happily married with a son and a thriving home, she would never have believed it. But the impossible had become real, proof that even the darkest winters eventually gave way to spring. When Tommy was nearly 2 years old, Laura discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to expect, and on a warm September day in 1888, she gave birth to a daughter they named Grace, for the grace that had brought them together and sustained them through hardship. "We have been so blessed," Garrett said, holding his daughter while Tommy tried to climb up his leg to see the new baby. "Sometimes I think about that day I rode up the mountain in the blizzard, and I wonder what would have happened if I had talked myself out of it, convinced myself it was too dangerous." "Let us not think about that," Laura said softly. "Let us just be grateful for what we have, for the life we have built together." The years passed in a blur of activity and joy. Tommy grew into a serious boy who loved the ranch and the animals, following his father around from the time he could walk. Grace was more like her mother, curious and determined, always asking questions and wanting to understand how things worked. Garrett and Laura worked together to expand the ranch, gradually increasing their herds and their land holdings, until the Patterson Ranch was one of the more successful operations in the region. Through it all, Laura never forgot Thomas, her first husband, but the sharp pain of grief had mellowed into bittersweet memory. She told Tommy and Grace about him sometimes, wanting them to know that they had been named for a good man, a brave man who had loved deeply and died too young. Garrett encouraged this, understanding that honoring Laura's past was part of honoring her present. In 1892, when Tommy was 6 and Grace was 4, Laura found herself pregnant once more, a surprise but a welcome one. This third child, another boy they named James, completed their family in a way that felt right and good. The house rang with the sounds of children playing, and the ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Mrs. Chen eventually retired from active household work, though she remained living with them, playing the role of beloved grandmother to the children and advisor to Laura and Garrett. They hired younger help to manage the household, but Mrs. Chen's presence was a constant, grounding reminder of how far they had all come. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Garrett presented Laura with a gift that took her breath away: the deed to her old cabin, which he had purchased from the land office and had completely renovated. Instead of a cold, isolated place of death, it was now a snug, well-built guest cabin, complete with a proper fireplace and sturdy roof. "I thought we could use it as a family retreat," Garrett explained. "A place to go in summer when we want to escape the heat, where the kids can play in the meadow and we can remember how we found each other. But Laura, if you do not like the idea, if it is too painful, we can sell it or tear it down. I will understand." Laura walked through the transformed cabin, running her hands over the smooth walls and the solid floor, remembering but not hurting. "It is perfect," she said finally. "You have taken a place of pain and made it a place of hope. That is the most wonderful gift you could give me." They used the cabin often after that, spending long summer weekends there with the children, swimming in the nearby creek and hiking through the pine forests. Tommy loved to fish, and Garrett taught him patiently, the two of them spending hours by the water while Laura and Grace picked wildflowers and James toddled after butterflies. One evening, as they sat on the porch of the cabin watching the sun set over the mountains, the children asleep inside, Garrett pulled Laura close and said quietly, "Do you ever regret it? Marrying me so soon after Thomas died? I know people talked." Laura turned to look at him, this man who had saved her life and then filled it with love and purpose. "Never," she said firmly. "Not even for a moment. You gave me back my life, Garrett, and I gave you my heart freely. What we have built together is real and true and worth any amount of gossip or judgment." "I love you," Garrett said simply. "More today than the day I married you, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today." "That is the most romantic thing you have ever said to me," Laura teased, but her eyes were bright with tears. "Then I should say romantic things more often," Garrett replied, and kissed her as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. The children grew and thrived, each developing their own personalities and dreams. Tommy proved to have a natural talent for working with horses, training and breeding them with skill that exceeded even his father's. By the time he was 16, people were coming from counties away to buy Anderson horses, and the ranch's reputation continued to grow. Grace showed less interest in ranch work and more in learning, devouring every book she could get her hands on and excelling at the small school in Hamilton. Laura and Garrett encouraged this, even though education for girls was often seen as unnecessary, and made plans to send her to a teaching college in California when she was old enough. Young James was the most social of their children, charming and friendly, able to talk to anyone about anything. Garrett predicted he would end up in business or politics, skills that would serve the family well as the West continued to develop and change. In 1898, when Tommy was 12, Grace 10, and James 6, tragedy struck when Mrs. Chen passed away peacefully in her sleep, dying at the impressive age of 71. The entire family mourned her loss deeply, this woman who had been part of their lives for so long. They buried her in the Hamilton cemetery with a proper headstone that read, "Beloved friend and family," and Laura planted her favorite flowers on the grave. "She was there at the beginning," Laura said to Garrett as they stood by the grave after the funeral. "She welcomed me into your home when I was lost and broken, treated me with kindness when I needed it most. I will never forget that." "She loved you like a daughter," Garrett said. "And she loved the children like they were her own grandchildren. We were lucky to have her in our lives." Life continued, marked by the usual joys and sorrows of any family. There were hard winters and dry summers, good years for the cattle and bad years, illnesses that scared them and recoveries that brought relief. Through it all, Laura and Garrett's love remained constant, the bedrock upon which everything else was built. When Tommy turned 20, he fell in love with Sarah Mitchell, the daughter of a neighboring rancher, and Garrett and Laura watched with joy as their son experienced the same kind of deep, true love they had found with each other. The wedding was a major event, with people coming from all over the county to celebrate, and when Sarah moved into the ranch house with them, Laura found herself welcoming a daughter with open arms. Grace, true to her ambitions, went off to teaching college and eventually became a teacher in Reno, marrying a kind bank clerk named Henry and having 3 children of her own. She visited often, bringing her family to the ranch for holidays and summers, and Laura treasured every moment with her daughter and grandchildren. James, the charmer, went into business in Hamilton, opening a successful mercantile that served the whole region. He married a girl from town named Elizabeth, and they had 5 children in rapid succession, filling the small town with Anderson grandchildren. As Laura and Garrett moved into their 50s and then their 60s, they gradually handed over more of the ranch operations to Tommy and Sarah, though they never fully retired. The ranch had grown to over 1,000 acres and 500 head of cattle, a substantial operation that provided comfortable livings for multiple families. On a spring evening in 1910, 25 years after their marriage, Laura and Garrett rode up to the cabin in the mountains, something they still did regularly even as their bodies grew older and less spry. They sat on the porch in the rocking chairs Tommy had made for them, watching the sun set in a blaze of color. "Do you remember the first time I came up here?" Garrett asked, his hand finding hers as naturally as breathing. "How could I forget?" Laura replied. "You burst through that door like some kind of winter spirit, bringing wood and food and hope when I had given up on everything." "I was so scared I would be too late," Garrett admitted. "The whole way up that mountain, I kept thinking about Thomas asking me to look after you, and I kept praying that I would find you alive." "You did more than find me alive," Laura said softly. "You taught me how to live again. You gave me a family, a home, a future I never dreamed possible. Garrett, you are the best thing that ever happened to me, second chances included." Garrett raised her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. "The best thing that ever happened to me was having the courage to ride up this mountain in a blizzard. Everything good in my life stems from that decision." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, the same stars Laura had been afraid to look at all those years ago. But now she could see them without pain, could appreciate their beauty as part of the vast, mysterious tapestry of life that had brought her through grief and into joy. "I love you," Garrett said quietly as he did every night. "I love you too," Laura replied, as she always had and always would. "From the moment you broke through that snow and said, 'Come home,' even though I did not realize it yet." "Come home," Garrett repeated, smiling at the memory. "That is what I said, is it not? But Laura, you did not just come home with me that day. You became my home. You and the children and this life we built together. That is what home really is, not a place but the people we love." Laura leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart, and thought about how right he was. Home was not the cabin where she had nearly died, or even the ranch house where they had raised their children. Home was this man beside her, the love they shared, the family they had created, the memories they had built over a quarter century together. As they sat watching the stars wheel overhead, Laura thought about writing a letter to her mother, who had passed away 5 years earlier, but who had lived long enough to know her daughter was happy and thriving. She thought about Thomas, her first love, who she believed would be glad to know she had found joy again. She thought about all the twists and turns her life had taken, the sorrows and the triumphs, and felt grateful for every moment, even the painful ones, because they had led her here. "What are you thinking about?" Garrett asked, sensing her reflective mood. "I am thinking about Grace," Laura said. "Not our daughter, though I am thinking about her too, but the concept. The undeserved kindness, the second chances, the way life can surprise us with joy when we least expect it. I am thinking about how I came to this territory as a young bride full of dreams, lost everything, and then found even more than I had lost. That is grace, is it not?" "It is," Garrett agreed. "And it is also love. The kind of love that risks everything, that breaks through blizzards and walls of grief, that believes in possibility even when it seems impossible. We have been lucky, Laura. Not just lucky to find each other, but lucky to have the courage to reach for happiness when it was offered." They stayed on the mountain that night, sleeping in the cabin that had been transformed from a place of death to a place of life. And in the morning, they rode back down to the ranch together, ready for whatever the future would bring, secure in the knowledge that they would face it side by side. Years continued to pass, marked by grandchildren and great-grandchildren, by the steady rhythm of ranch life, by the changing seasons and the constants of love and family. Laura and Garrett grew old together, their hands gnarled with age but still reaching for each other, their steps slower but still walking the same path. When Laura was 73, Garrett became ill with pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. For weeks he lay in bed, struggling for breath, and Laura barely left his side, tending him with the same fierce determination she brought to everything she loved. Tommy tried to convince her to rest, to let others help, but she refused. "I was there when he saved my life," she said simply. "I will be here for whatever comes next." But Garrett, stubborn as ever, recovered. Spring came, and with it renewed strength, and soon he was back outside, though moving more carefully than before. Laura scolded him for overexerting himself, and he laughed and promised to be more cautious, and they continued their life together. In 1923, at the age of 74, Laura suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed on one side. But even then, with her body failing, her spirit remained strong. Garrett tended her with infinite patience, helping her relearn how to walk, how to use her left hand, never complaining about the extra work or the changes to their routine. "You saved me once," he said when she tried to apologize for being a burden. "Let me return the favor now." Laura recovered enough to regain most of her mobility, though she was never quite the same. But she could still sit on the porch with Garrett, still hold his hand, still tell stories to the ever-growing collection of grandchildren and great-grandchildren who came to visit the legendary couple who had built the Anderson Ranch from almost nothing. On a clear autumn day in 1925, surrounded by family, Garrett Anderson died peacefully at the age of 76, with Laura holding his hand and whispering that she loved him. The grief was sharp and deep, but it was tempered by gratitude for the 40 years they had shared, the life they had built, the love that had sustained them through everything. Laura lived for 3 more years, long enough to see Tommy firmly established as the patriarch of the Anderson family, long enough to hold her first great-great-grandchild, long enough to know that the legacy she and Garrett had built would endure. She spent her final years in the ranch house, surrounded by family, telling stories about the early days and the blizzard that had changed everything. On a spring morning in 1928, Laura Vance Anderson died in her sleep at the age of 79. She was buried next to Garrett in the Hamilton cemetery, under a stone that read, "Beloved wife, mother, grandmother." She came home and brought love with her. At the funeral, Tommy stood before the large gathering and told the story his mother had shared so many times, about the widow freezing alone in her cabin, about the cowboy who broke through the snow and said, "Come home," about the love that grew from that desperate moment of salvation. He spoke about the ranch they had built, the family they had raised, the example they had set of courage and compassion and unwavering devotion. "My mother used to say that the coldest winter could not freeze a warm heart," Tommy said, his voice breaking with emotion. "She and my father proved that every day of their lives together. They showed us that love can survive anything, that second chances are real, that grace exists in the most unexpected places." The Anderson family stands today because of their courage, their love, and their refusal to give up on life even when it seemed darkest. That is their legacy, and it is one we will carry forward for generations to come. The Anderson Ranch continued to thrive for decades after Laura and Garrett were gone, each generation adding to and building upon what they had started. The cabin in the mountains became a family shrine of sorts, a place where Andersons would go to reconnect with their roots, to remember the story of how it all began. The main ranch house was eventually added to the National Register of Historic Places, recognized as an important example of early Nevada ranching life. But more than the physical structures or the business success, what endured was the story itself, the tale of the widow and the cowboy, the blizzard and the rescue, the love that grew from tragedy and became something beautiful and lasting. It became part of Anderson family lore, told and retold, a reminder that the best love stories are not always the ones that begin with fairy tale perfection, but the ones that triumph over real hardship and forge something stronger than either person could create alone. The story of Laura and Garrett became emblematic of the Western spirit itself, the way people carved lives and communities out of harsh wilderness through determination, mutual support, and love. Historians studying early Nevada ranching would eventually discover their story, and it would be featured in books and articles about the settlement of the West, a counterpoint to the more common narratives of violence and exploitation. But for the Anderson family, it was never about history or legacy in the abstract. It was about the very real, very human truth that sometimes, when all seems lost, salvation can come in unexpected forms. It was about the importance of reaching out to help others, even when it is difficult or dangerous to do so. It was about the resilience of the human heart, the way love can bloom even in the harshest conditions. When great-grandchildren would ask about the original Laura and Garrett, about what they were really like beyond the stories and legends, those who had known them would say they were ordinary people who made extraordinary choices. They were not perfect, not heroes in the mythological sense, but real human beings who struggled and failed and succeeded and loved with everything they had. And perhaps that was the most important part of their story, the part that resonated across generations. They proved that happiness was possible after loss, that love could come more than once in a lifetime, that it was never too late to choose life over mere survival. They showed that courage was not the absence of fear or grief, but the decision to keep going, to keep hoping, to keep reaching for connection even when it would be easier to retreat into isolation. The mountains where they had found each other continued to stand, covered in snow each winter, bright with wildflowers each summer, eternal and unchanging even as the world around them transformed beyond recognition. And in those mountains, in that cabin that had witnessed both despair and redemption, the spirit of their love endured, a testament to the power of human connection and the possibility of grace, even in the darkest moments. "Come home," Garrett had said, breaking through the snow and the walls of grief to reach a woman he barely knew. "Come home." And Laura had followed him down the mountain into a life she could never have imagined, a love she could never have predicted, a future that honored her past while embracing new possibilities. Together they had built something that lasted, not just in property or descendants, but in the example they set, the love they shared, and the proof they offered that the human heart, even when frozen with grief, can thaw and bloom again when given warmth and hope and a reason to believe. Their story became a reminder that we are all capable of being both the rescued and the rescuer, that we all have within us the capacity to offer grace to others and to accept it when it is offered to us. In a harsh land that could be unforgiving, they created a pocket of warmth and love and family that sustained not just them, but generations that followed. That was their real legacy, not measured in acres or cattle or material success, but in the love that rippled outward from their union, touching countless lives and proving that from the coldest winter could come the warmest spring, from the deepest grief could come the most profound joy, and from a moment of courage in a blizzard could come a lifetime of love.